the t-shirt the other day to physical therapy because I'm an old person, and oh, soccer in the background. Okay, I can actually probably do that. But let's see, can I do that? No, I wore my Angelo State University shirt to physical therapy, and my physical therapist says, "Why are you wearing that shirt?" And I said, "Because I went there." And he goes, "I did too." And I went, "Okay." So the background, that's my soccer fields. By mine, I don't mean I own them. It's where the club that I manage plays. So there you go. And just caught it on a good day. It was a nice sunset. So there you are. All right. You probably are not excited about the soccer fields though. So let's talk about some other stuff like your assignments. So I'm sorry that I haven't finished grading everything, but I should tonight and or tomorrow. So I'll get caught up, and people are asking, can I submit stuff more than once? I'm still going to go with no for a little bit longer because I just don't want to grade your stuff twice or 3 times. So, and it's college, so you know, you're only supposed to turn it in once. Quiz, you probably noticed there's a quiz coming up this week. It should go live tonight at midnight, or essentially 12:01, and it should stay available until Friday at 11:59. So you don't really do that during class. You're supposed to do that kind of on your own. And class next time we'll talk about the weekly question. So you got to carve out a little bit of time, some point in the next few days, to do the quiz. If I'm suggesting stuff to you for quiz time, why not during class time on Friday, unless you have something that you have to do for your English class. But the quiz is super short, 8 questions. I think it'll take you 10 or 15 minutes at the most. You know, of course, you're just supposed to answer the questions from memory. You're not supposed to look them up. And you can only take it once. So you got to take it when you look at it. You can't look at it, go away, look at more stuff, then come back and do it. And it is timed, but I've given you plenty of time to take it. So you have to do it all in one sitting, and you're not supposed to look stuff up while you do it. Okay? So, and I'll give you a survey probably Monday, because I got like a big weekend long meeting. That's a fun thing about being an adult, is sometimes you get weekend long meetings because you didn't have enough during the week. So I'm probably not going to grade stuff over the weekend, and I probably won't do the survey over the weekend, but the survey will just ask you about the quiz to see, you know, your thoughts. Mostly what I'm looking for on the quiz is, would you rather have more questions? And I know some of you are going like, why would we want more questions? Because, you know, that way you can miss more. So, you know, you'll have to decide after you take it. So also some other people said, is there a review? It's like, yeah, there's a review. Anytime you're wondering like, where can I find stuff, check the course documents page first, because that is typically where I'll put course documents. It's aptly named. Also, I did put the Unit 2 weekly questions there. They're not due, of course, until the middle of October, because, you know, the ones that are due Friday are, you know, they're not done yet. So, but I want to give you a head start on those for those of you who are the people that like to get ahead, you know, plan ahead. And maybe you've got stuff coming up that makes you need to plan ahead. That happens sometimes. So, all right. You guys have any questions before we start looking at the notes and the weekly question? Weekly question we actually won't go over today. We'll go over next time. It's about the Spanish-American War. Perhaps you've heard of it because you had a Spanish class. You probably didn't hear about it in a history class. Spanish class. Those are really valuable. Potentially. Okay. You guys are paying attention, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I like how you guys usually get one spokesperson, like who answers for all of you. I like it. It's good. It's representative. It's very American of you. All right, so just in case you're wondering, weekly questions about Spanish-American War. Causes of stated purposes for and eventual results of U.S. entry into the Spanish-American War. So why did we go? What caused us to go? What did we want? What did we get? Is essentially what I'm asking. Be sure to discuss the USS Maine. It's a ship that blew up. Teller and Platt amendments. When you talk about those, tell me what they amended, because, you know, if it's the U.S. Constitution, it's not in this instance. It usually just has a number before it, you know, 13th Amendment or 18th or something like that. So 18th, that'll be your favorite one later on. So Teller and Platt amendments amends somebody's constitution with the Platt and declaration of war with Teller. And did the citizens of the new U.S. territories prosper, enjoy freedom? There's a really specific section about that in your textbook. So I had someone turn that in already. I don't think it was from your class, but you know, they turned it in and they said, yeah, really, they had a great time, I'm sure. The book didn't really talk about it. Oh dear. The book is very, very specific about it because Foner sees that as an issue. So he talks about it a lot. And that's part of the reason I asked that part of the question. So this last part, I mean, if you tell me like the book doesn't talk about it, I will say like, you're not reading the book. Because yeah, Foner's the author of the textbook too. I forgot to mention that. So there you go. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing that. Oh, a question is exciting. Soccer. Okay, there you go. Yeah, soccer. You can kind of see the goals, like right back there. Yep. And the lights, we have lights. Okay, enough. All right, notes then. Yeah, we start soccer in a week or two, so every email or text I get right now in my not ACC account is about soccer. All right. So mostly we'll talk about everything in the chapter except the Spanish-American War today, and I'll have to be kind of fast, so apologies about that. And we may stop just for a minute in the middle to double check on attendance. And I'll probably cut short the populist talk. Oh, somebody's got music. I don't get to talk as long in your class as I do the other classes. Historians really like to talk about the populist, which is why it's hard for me to cut it short, because we don't often get third parties who are successful. So when we talk about a third party in US politics, we're just talking about somebody who's not Democrat or Republican. So it doesn't mean there's only 3. There's usually like 10 third parties. There's a bunch of third parties, and they usually are pretty much unsuccessful. So in lots of other systems, there's one party. That usually is a bad sign for you. It's probably a communist party, but you're probably in a totalitarian regime if there's only one party. There are occasions where there's there's one party, but there's different factions within the party, and it operates, you know, like a more democratic version of a government where, you know, people have more options. Typically, modern era countries have multiple parties who have to work together to form a coalition government. You may or may not have been watching the news today, but there's an unusual Middle East peace accord that was signed. There's a lot of unusual stuff in the news today. You don't normally watch, you may want to check into it. Lots of interesting things have happened, but this peace accord was signed, and they had the prime minister of Israel, who's Benjamin or Bibi Netanyahu, whose party did not win the election, but formed a coalition with another party that they shared votes with and made him the prime minister. And behind the scenes, they made some other deals about laws that needed to be passed. That's typically how it works in the modern era, is there's 3 or 4 different parties, and to win the election, you got to make deals with people, which means you necessarily have to compromise. In the US system, the other side is just the devil, and whatever they do is always evil. So there's no need for compromise, at least in the modern era. You will see times in US history. I know that bargain of 1877 was a compromise. However, that was kind of a bad one, my opinion. Although you probably agree with me, you don't have to. because they compromised away a group of people's rights. So that's not a nice thing. But at any rate, so in our system, two major parties, and if either of those two parties don't do what you want them to do, you'll form a third party. And your goal, honestly, is to take enough votes away from one of the two major parties that they will notice you and go like, hey, they took some votes away that we think should be ours. So here's what we should do. We should adopt their issue. And then one of the two major parties, Democrats or Republicans, adopt the issue, and then the third party disappears. That's kind of what happens in US politics. So whatever the third parties are now, apparently no one cares too much about their issues just yet. Like libertarians, no offense if you tend to be more of a libertarian, because it's Texas, we have a lot of those here. Ron Paul was one, and his son, who's a Tennessee dude, Rand Paul, is one as well, kind of, sort of. But they want the government to kind of stay out of stuff. And I know when I taught high school, when I had high school kids that liked libertarians, I would ask them, like, why do you like libertarians? And they would say, here's why I like libertarians. They think it's okay to legalize marijuana. Like, that is true. But they also think you should not have subsidized college tuition, which probably, you know, most kids your age want free college or subsidized college. So libertarians just want the government to stay out of stuff. Yeah, and that's not a very modern thing. All right, populists. I know you were wondering, like, is she actually going to talk about populist party? Yes. Populists or farmers? Oh, crud. Did I record this?
It's recording.
Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Like, how? Oh, I'm supposed to know this, aren't I? Ah, okay. Sorry. So, populist farmers. So, farmers felt like the current political system was leaving them out, because it was leaving them out, because there weren't so many of them. And while they had been fairly important, especially in Southern politics, as the country is becoming more industrial, there's fewer of them because the farms are becoming more corporate, more industrial. They're consolidating, so there's fewer farm owners. And there are more business owners relative to farm owners, and the cities are growing pretty rapidly during this time period. So farmers do feel like they're being left out because they're being left out. They're not prospering as much economically. The prices of what they sell are actually going down, while prices of what they buy to produce what they sell are going up. So they're losing money. They form groups called farmers' alliances to organize for political and economic purposes. And they talk about ways that maybe they can sell their crops together for higher prices, but forming these co-ops doesn't work very well because they're not close to each other and their methods of communication aren't as advanced. They do have phones, potentially, telegraph also. Neither one of those are terribly convenient during that time period because a cell phone, definitely not a cell phone, and they don't live close to each other. So having meetings, physical meetings, is hard. Farmers' alliances do allow African American members. The reason historians like to point that out is because the previous group of farmers that got together, the National Grange, did not. Okay, so that's why. And you're thinking, well, that was probably before slavery, and you are correct. However, there are lots of farmers in the North, and they still didn't let Black folks join. Okay, so farmers' alliances have segregated African American units. They are going to form a political party, which will be nicknamed the People's Party or Populist Party. They will have some success locally, especially in farming states like Texas. In the 1890s, I can't remember which year, it's probably 94, they controlled the Congress, the Texas Congress, and the governorship. So in farming states, the Populist Party is going to have pretty good success in local and state elections, sometimes national elections, and I'm talking Congress here, House of Representatives typically. You know, that's the one that's represented by population. So if you're in a farming area, if you're in West Texas or East Texas, then yeah, you might have had a populist guy go to the federal Congress, go to DC. As far as winning National elections like the presidency or the Senate, not so much. But they are going to run national candidates, and they'll have a platform, which is list of stuff they want to do if they get elected. 1892. They run a presidential candidate. Hey, I'm assuming that you know all kinds of stuff about the US government, which may or may not be true. So I assume that you know every 4 years we have a presidential election, whether you want one or not. And typically the Democrats and Republicans run a candidate, and occasionally we have a third party guy on the candidate. In 1892, we had a third party guy on the candidate. The other elections, like congressional elections, happen every 2 years. And in the House, everyone, like the whole thing, everybody in there has 2-year terms. So they run for election every 2 years. So those people are always campaigning. That's got to be exhausting. In the Senate, 6-year terms. So a third of the Senate is always up for election. So, and then the presidency is 4 years. Okay, and Senate, 2 per state. House, more people in your state, the more guys run for the House. And of course, president, 1. It's enough, right? When they first started talking about the Constitution, they considered 7 presidents. That would be fun, wouldn't it? 7 presidents. All right, the guy who runs for president in 1892 for the Populist Party is James Weaver. I believe he's from Iowa, which is perfect because that's certainly a big farm state. And he gets over 1 million votes, which is enough in 1892 that people go like, oh my gosh, he took votes away from us. And you may have noticed, if you paid attention to recent elections, that sometimes people win states by 50,000 votes. So 1 million votes can be consequential. So people noticed that. Oh, and I forgot to say his slogan was raise less corn and more hell. Woohoo, go rowdy farmers. And they also favored minimum wage, voting rights for women, and a sub-treasury system. Minimum wage, it's whatever it is now. I don't know, $7.50 an hour. But that's the least that your employer can pay you. They didn't have a minimum wage back then, so he could get away, or she, but it's probably he could get away with paying you as little as possible. Women's voting rights, that's not going to get women to vote for you because they can't, but it might get them to help campaign for you. And there's certainly men who thought women should vote. And the sub-treasury system was an economic system to help farmers. I definitely am not asking you any quiz questions about the sub-treasury system. It's kind of complicated. Not that I don't think you could understand it, it's just didn't rise to the level of earning its own question, my opinion. Okay, so Weaver, populist, million votes, raise less corn, more hell. And goal here is to get people who are not farmers to vote for Weaver because there aren't enough farmers to get Weaver elected. So the minimum wage stuff, and in some instances, the voting rights stuff, was to get people in the city to vote for a pro-farmer party. All right, so who did notice were Democrats who said, my gosh, that's 1 million votes. We could have used those. So in 1896, both the Democrats and the Populists nominate the same guy. What this will do is essentially end the Populist Party, because now the Democrats have said, yes, we also are pro-farmer. And the Republicans looked at it too, I'm sure, and said, 1 million votes, that's not real, those are not really our people. Okay, so William Jennings Bryan runs for president, and he's nominated by both the Democrats and the Populists. He gives a very famous Cross of Gold speech. I think there's a little excerpt of it in your textbook in one of those pages where it says, where it gives you a primary source document. And he compares the farmers to Jesus. In this time period, that's a really, really good political strategy because most of the people in the United States are Christians during that time period. Statistically, probably still true, but a little different in that era because most of them went to church pretty consistently. And the one book everybody had and occasionally read, or at least was familiar with, was a Bible. So when they make biblical references, this idea of the crown of thorns and the cross of gold, Certainly people would have recognized the crown of thorns as what was placed on Jesus' head right before he was crucified and died for people's sins. And in this instance, the cross of gold represented the economic system in its current setting, which favored businessmen over farmers. So the cross was of gold, and farmers wanted a silver standard for their money, which helps us transition into our list of things that farmers wanted. And I know I mentioned this at least 2 or 3 times, but Brian also nominated by Democrats. Other platform items included minimum wage. That's to try to get workers to vote for you. They also talked about a maximum number of working hours. Free coinage of silver. So this is to get more money in circulation, which will create inflation. And some of you are going like, I hear that's bad. Yeah, most economists would agree with you and your parents when they're buying stuff. You too. I mean, you buy stuff too. I know you do. It makes costs go up. It would also increase the wages that you earned. And farmers thought, if we increase inflation, we'll make more money selling our corn or wheat, WHEAT, or alfalfa or soybeans or whatever else the heck we're growing, cotton in the South. Government ownership of telephone, telegraph, and the railroad. And the reason they thought that was a good idea is because all of those industries ripped off farmers and ranchers. And that's true, they did. So their thought was, the government runs these things, they'll run them more equitably, more fairly, and more efficiently. And at least one of those might be true. So it's also why, you know, in the modern era, we usually don't want an individual to own certain utility kinds of things. Like, say if you live where I live, when I pay my electricity bill, I don't pay like Fred, the owner of the electric company, I pay Pedernales Electric Cooperative, PEC. If you live in Austin, you pay the city of Austin. And we typically want the government to own those because we think they will not rip us off, that they will not say, look, if you don't pay me twice as much as you think you should pay, you're not getting any electricity. So we in the modern era think the government probably should own some of these entities so that we're treated fairly. In that era, this is kind of a new thought. It's not going to be overly popular. So when the election happens, I know we haven't mentioned the other guy, but the other guy is William Jennings Bryan. And he runs, William McKinley. William Jennings Bryan, we've already mentioned a bunch. And he runs around giving speeches. I don't know that he's running around, but he travels quite a bit. And his campaigning goal is to go to as many places as possible and give as many speeches as possible. McKinley's not doing that. He's a little older. I forgot to mention, William Jennings Bryan, the youngest guy, I think, to ever run for president, he's 36. You have to be at least 35. So, or in this election cycle, as close to 80 as possible. William Jennings Bryan runs as the populist and Democrat. He gives speech. William McKinley runs as the Republican. He's not super old. He's, I think, in his 50s, maybe close to 60. And he mostly spends money on advertising, which is why they refer to it as the first modern campaign. When they say it's a front porch campaign, they mean he doesn't travel as much. He brings people to him. He also will ride on trains and give speeches from the back of the train. He doesn't like to travel so much because, I don't know, he doesn't like to travel. Also, his wife has epilepsy and she doesn't do well when she travels, and he wants to be near her because, you know, it's early in the game for treating epilepsy. Certainly people must have had it since you can have a disease. But, you know, they're just a little past thinking you're demon possessed if you have a seizure. So he's, you know, being a nice husband, I suppose. So, all right. If you're wondering why the factory workers didn't vote for populist, probably, I don't know if you've heard this weird saying, all politics is local. So whatever affects you more locally is probably how you're going to vote. And in this instance, they had things called political machines, the most famous in New York City, run by a fellow named William Tweed, or Boss Tweed. And he essentially told business owners how to vote in that area. And if they didn't vote the way he wanted them to vote, then there were certain things they didn't get, like police protection or fire protection or building permits or government contracts. And these are all things that local businessmen want and need. So local businessmen would then tell their employees, if you'd like to keep working for us, you need to vote the way we tell you to vote. So they did. So locally, you're going to vote however your boss tells you to vote. And there were very few business owners that wanted you to vote for guys that wanted minimum wage because that means your boss is just about to have to pay you more. Even though it's in your best interest to vote for them on the national level, to keep your job, you're going to vote for whoever your boss tells you to vote for. Now, locally, it's sort of interesting. Most of these politicians who ran political machines were Democrats, but on the national ticket, they were more likely to want their employees to vote for Republicans. And if you're wondering, like, well, how did they know anyway? Because your vote's a secret. It is now. It wasn't then. So they could actually put people at the polling place as workers, and they would keep a little checklist and they'd check off who you voted for. And the ballot box was made of glass, so they could actually see your ballot when you dropped it. All right, deep breath. Any questions you would like to ask at this moment? I'm looking to see. Doesn't look like it. All right, here's a new thought. People were racist during this time period. I know, we haven't seen that in history before, so crud. Here's some evidence of that statement. I know you're going like, that's a wild claim. Can you back that up? I think I can. Okay. And again, I'm not saying all people, all politicians, I am saying that people running things were content to let racist things continue. So, Southern states able to reconstruct however they like after the bargain of 1877. So they're going to begin discriminating again without the federal government coming in to intervene. So they can assess poll taxes and literacy tests to former slaves and have the grandfather clause to exempt white people from those things. Supreme Court has rulings where they say states are not required to enforce 14th and 15th Amendments. Just as a refresher, 14th, equal protection under the law for all citizens. It made former slave citizens. And the 15th Amendment, Black men can vote, and those poll taxes and literacy tests definitely restrict that. And then the Supreme Court rules in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, which is hugely important and you have to pay attention to, 1896, that when facilities are separate but essentially equal, segregation is legal. The guy who filed this case, the Plessy fellow, from Louisiana, African-American dude who was light-skinned and pretty well off. He wanted to ride in the whites-only car of the train, which is in the back because you don't get as much stuff on you from the train engine. He wanted to set a precedent that if he paid the same fare as white folks, he could sit in the same car as white folks. He gets arrested, files suit, and loses. So the end result is that segregation spreads from the South to the entire country. Your book's also going to talk a little about redeemers in this chapter, and those are guys in the South who get political control, and their goal is to restore the South to its past greatness, which means how they were before the Civil War, with, of course, without directly owning slaves. So going to stay reliant on growing cotton. They don't diversify their industries, but the one change, and your book mentions this, it's an important change too. We'll probably talk about it more when we talk about the 1930s a little bit, is that prisons become profitable. So because prisons are profitable, local areas have more reason to arrest people and put them in jail. The way prisons became profitable during that era is they would assign people prison terms for relatively minor stuff, usually petty theft. And then while you're in prison, they would rent you out as laborers. So convict labor becomes a really big moneymaker for local and state prisons. And that's going to continue for a really long time. You know, I mentioned in the earlier classes, there's this weird movie that I did used to show my high school students at least clips of from time to time called Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? which really isn't that much about prisons. But these guys escaped from a prison labor system called Parchman Farm, which is a real legitimate prison and has a really interesting book written about it if you ever want to read about stuff like that. In the modern era, personally, I think we still have this issue, but it's with private prisons rather than state-run prisons, because private prisons are run for profit, which is a weird thought, to think about putting people in jail so you can make money. But it creates a system where it becomes profitable to keep people in jail, so there's less incentive to get people out. Plus, I don't know, we'll talk about that later, because I have a limited amount of time. Okay. Lynching. Oh, gosh. We're not talking about any pleasant stuff today, are we? I think people have a general idea of what lynching is, which is probably incorrect. I know that, from certainly when I was your age, we were taught that lynching is when somebody got mad at a black guy, would sneak out in the middle of the night, grab him, kill him, hang him to a tree, and then people would find his body in the morning. And that certainly did happen and might have been more lynching in the 20th century. But when we're talking late 1800s, early 20th century, so late 19th, early 20th century, lynching was much more of a community event where the person that they were going to lynch was kidnapped, grabbed in the middle of the day or early in the day, take him to a very public place, hang him probably by his arms, light a fire under him, do something to torture him through the day. People would gather, bring picnics, bring their kids, play games. And then toward the end of the day, they would hang him by the neck. So they would kill him as the sun set. And then people would go and pose next to dead body to take pictures. And then they would make postcards as souvenirs and send them to their friends. They would also take trophies or souvenirs from the hanging and maybe cut off the dead man's ears, toes, or fingers and take them with them. This could not be much more horrific and was often written about in local newspapers. And this group called Without Sanctuary, and if you look at that link, it's linked to some stuff about evidence that they gathered of these lynchings. This group sent people around to antique shops in primarily the South, but this happened in the North and the Midwest as well, occasionally in the West. They sent people to antique shops to purchase these old postcards, and they made collections of them, and they found thousands of them. So lynching is a very serious problem, late 1800s, early 1900s. I know it continues through the 1960s and 70s with some regularity, and in the modern era much less frequently, but still continued, to the extent that there were probably hundreds of these each year. And if you look at old community newspapers, you're likely to find newspaper articles about a lynching. So it's pretty common stuff. When the NAACP was formed, one of the primary reasons they formed was to make lynching illegal. It wasn't seen as a crime. It was never prosecuted. And very rarely were people lynched as a result of, the outcome of a trial that they didn't agree with. Typically, you just accused a black guy of something. Primarily, he looked at a white woman, and then you just decided you, as a community, were going to kill him, and you did. And there were not communities that I'm aware of who stood up against this sort of thing. This is pretty heinous stuff. Now, it's not government sponsored, but it's definitely government tolerated. So, all right, more cheery stuff. Maybe we treat immigrants better. Nah, we don't like immigrants either. The reason we don't like immigrants during this time period is they're not like us, whatever we are. And whatever we are is white Protestant Christians. So during this era, I know we've talked about how we get 30 million new immigrants in this era. They're less likely to speak English, less likely to be Protestant Christians. Sometimes they were Catholic. Oh, that makes us nervous. Except I know this part of the country, we're not nervous about Catholics, but the rest of the country kind of is. Eastern or Russian Orthodox, sometimes Jewish, sometimes not Christian at all. I know Jews aren't Christians, by the way. You know, sometimes they're agnostic or atheist, and if that's the truth, they're not telling anybody because that's extremely unpopular. A lot of times they're from countries where there's a lot of unrest, like Russia or Austria, Hungary, and they're less likely to be accepted than immigrants who come in speaking English from Protestant backgrounds. So those folks, English-speaking Protestant immigrants, are seen as more potentially American, easier to assimilate. And the secondary reason, or maybe it's the primary, another reason we don't like immigrants during this era, there's no minimum wage. So since there's no minimum wage, all the new folks bring wages down. So you're going to make less money because some desperate immigrant's going to come in and take $1 for a day's work when you used to get paid $2. So he's costing you money. So that's kind of the assumption. But then you're thinking, well, I bet they're better on the West Coast because you're probably talking primarily Northeast here. I am primarily. But you would be wrong if you thought they were better on the West Coast. They're just going to discriminate against different groups. So the different groups they're discriminating against are Asians, primarily Chinese and Japanese. Japanese immigrants tended to come a little bit earlier and then a little bit later. Earlier ones, landowners, probably farmers. Later ones, business owners, and primarily in major cities in California, eventually Nevada and Oregon, and Washington. But they didn't have as many major cities in the early days. And Chinese immigrants are primarily going to come because they're recruited by railroad companies building in the West. Once the railroads are built, if the Chinese Americans or Chinese immigrants stayed, they probably became business owners, more likely that than farmers. Japanese immigrants, a lot of families, more families. Chinese immigrants, mostly dudes. And the thought for these guys was they would make money, send it back home because the economy was bad in China during this time period. And as the economy improved, they would go back home. Well, the economy just didn't really improve. So you would think that folks in the West would be appreciative of the role these folks played in building up the West, building the railroads, establishing businesses and farms. Not so much. They were frustrated because the Asian immigrants didn't appear to assimilate well. They tended to continue to wear clothing that was more like their home countries than their new country. They certainly were not speaking English regularly, and these folks are not any kind of Protestant Christians as a rule, just saying. So these folks were highly disliked, and as a group, and the West, in the West, they passed laws to discriminate against them. Chinese Exclusion Act is exactly what it sounds like. Passed in the 1880s, I think it's 86, but it just says no more Chinese immigrants. That's what it says. So the exceptions were if your family was already here, you could have people come over, which will happen eventually. And the Gentleman's Agreement, which we'll talk about later, 1907, bans Japanese immigration unless they are skilled laborers or have money, can start businesses. And Asian land laws were passed at a certain point to prohibit Asians from purchasing land and in some instances passing land along through inheritance. So, and this Gentleman's Agreement, which I said we'll talk about later, also has to do with segregating public schools to make sure white kids and Asian kids don't go to school together because Asian kids will bring down the quality of learning for white kids because they're not going to be as good as students, which probably suggests a different stereotype about Asian students than we have now. Women's groups are going to unify during this era. So the group that used to say like, hey, we don't want black guys voting because they're stupid and they're not as educated as white women, that group stops talking about that. And they have the National Women's Suffrage and the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they merged to form the National American Women's Suffrage Movement, which just says, we want an amendment so women can vote. And it doesn't say racist stuff about black men, but later on it'll say racist stuff about immigrant men. So just hold on. You thought the women's groups were done saying rude stuff, but not quite. They're close though. All right, one more thing before we go. Hey, okay, labor unions. Two major labor unions during this time period. I think this is on your list of stuff to study for the quiz as well. The major labor union in this era is Knights of Labor. They're kind of different. They think everyone should join, men, women, blacks, whites, whatever ethnicity you are, whatever job you do, as long as you work in a factory or a business that builds stuff, they want you in. That also includes owners. So if you own a business or work at a business, they're glad to have you as a member. They get over 1 million members. And then something weird happens. They're supposed to have a meeting in Chicago, which is kind of the hub of labor movement activities. So they're going to have a meeting at Haymarket Square where they give speeches about, what they want as laborers. And then they find out that a group of anarchists are also going to come to that and do things that anarchists tend to do, which is blow stuff up and kill people. That is rarely helpful to your movement for change. So they decide, the Knights of Labor, that they're going to try to call this off, but there's not a really good way to communicate that. So there's still thousands of people who show up. The anarchists are among them. They do blow some stuff up and kill some police officers. The police and the newspapers in Chicago end up blaming, they talk about this, and they're both kind of irritated by the Knights of Labor. So they conspire to blame these activities solely on the Knights of Labor. And there were people who were members of both anarchist groups and the Knights of Labor, but for lots of reasons, they blame this on the Knights of Labor, and then the Knights of Labor starts to lose their membership. So it's a public discrediting of the Knights of Labor. So the next labor union, by the end of the century, there are essentially no members of the Knights of Labor, and it goes away. The AFL is the next group that emerges, American Federation of Labor. It's a more conservative union in some ways. They only want white men who are skilled laborers. So these are, people who are earning more money at the factories, and they just want what most people want: higher wages, better hours, better working conditions. And there's lots of reasons you could speculate as to why they're more successful. Definitely a smaller, more elite group of people. They're more essential to the process in factories. They're harder to train. They also look more like and behave more like the people they're negotiating with. Their membership is limited and more acceptable. Now, during this era, there are some major strikes. There are a couple mentioned here. If there are any mentioned on your list of things to study, you should study them. Just make sure you know the basic stuff that's going on. Most of these strikes are ended because the government, federal government, intervenes, puts down the strike, usually with troops. The US Army comes in and ends the strike, and they end it on behalf of the company. During this era, most of the time, the Attorney General, the head lawyer for the US government, is a railroad company, a former railroad company lawyer. If not, it's a corporate lawyer of some sort. So the government during this era strongly favors strongly favors business over employees in strikes. You'll see that change when we, a little, sometimes a lot, but at least a little, until once we get into the 20th century. The only group that I'm aware of, and I'm not a labor historian at all, it was not my thing. You probably figured out what my thing was. It's constitutional history. It had an emphasis on that, and civil rights history, 20th century. So, but labor history is really trendy now if you like that kind of stuff. But the Ladies Garment Workers Union went on strike against a really expensive clothing company, Hart, Schaffner and Marx, which is still in existence and still a really expensive clothing company. They do hand-tailored suits for men. Mostly suits are for men. I suppose women wear them too. And the women thought they deserved to make more money because they were doing all the work. and it was unusual work because you don't normally make clothing by hand. So their thought was, we should get more money. And their employers said, nope, we're the ones who market the stuff. We're the ones who take all the risk. Too bad, we'll just find other people to make these suits. So all the women went on strike, and within a month, they were all hired back at the wages that they asked for, because how many people do you know can make a suit by hand? That is a very unusual skill. And, you know, they marketed hand-tailored suits. They can't give you a suit that's made with sewing machine by somebody who's not as well trained or not as skilled. So you have an unusual skill. I guess that's kind of where we'll end the lecture for the day. You have an unusual skill. You have more power in the workplace. That is still true, I think, to this day. You may or may not agree with me. I don't know how in the workplace you guys are. Are you in the workplace? You guys have jobs? Who's got it? You don't have to tell me, by the way. Do you guys have jobs? Is anybody paying attention? You guys are making me nervous. Okay, but if you have kind of the common job, like let's say that you are, you work at HEB, and you're either, let's say you're the bagger or the stalker. Those are super important jobs. We found out this year how much more important they are than we probably ever thought. But you can train someone to do those things fairly quickly. The cashier part's a little harder, and there are other things that are probably require more skill. But let's say you're the lifeguard. That requires a whole different set of skills. So you probably get paid more as the lifeguard, although your hours, I know they're a little different because you can't have that job all year round. But you have to have more skills, more unique skills as a lifeguard, so, and more unique training. So you probably make more as a lifeguard than you do as HEB bagger, maybe. I don't know. And like a history teacher, we make ridiculous, okay, we don't make that much money. But I do have a unique skill, a vast knowledge of stuff people don't generally care about, but occasionally you're required to take. But it's not that unique. They're like your waiter at Olive Garden might have a degree in history. I wouldn't be surprised, to be honest. But you know, thankfully I have special training, so it helped me look better. But you know, I have a brother who's an electrician. His skill, honestly, is probably more valuable than mine. Probably. All right, I'm going to stop the recording and see if you have any questions. Or I guess I should wait. Do you have any questions? We got like 4 minutes. Anything you want to ask? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.